Do you see Nicola online?
No, I think she'll be back. I can send her a text, but she said she was just popping out for a moment.
Okay, so we will test after.
Yes, we tested her. There you are.
Hello.
Okay.
Yep, I'm back.
Hello, Nicola.
Hello.
How are you?
Oh, very well. How are you?
Yes, in the room, ready to start.
We're wishing that we were in Salzburg, but we're in Australia.
So in the room, I don't know if you see the room, but there are around 10 people.
Fantastic. Kai, I think I can see a tiny version of the backs of some of your heads.
So as we will have a discussion together, if you want to participate, please come in front to distribute the microphone easily, or it will be done by... Okay, thank you very much. Yes, yes. Yeah. So I guess that we will start. It's time. So welcome everybody to this sensitive data interest group of the RDA. The topic today is sensitive data classification and protocols across region. So I would like to thank Nicola Burton and Alex Mikhailevics that do the most of the work for this session, and Christian Homan that prepared the presentation that I will put for you. So as you know, we will follow the RDA guiding principle, openness, consensus, inclusive harmonization, community-driven, and non-profit and technology-neutral principles to work together and to try to build something and to build the next step. So you have here a QR code that could permit to tweet the session, or to X now. I don't know how to say that. But that's a way to communicate what we are doing. So please do if you have a phone. The agenda after this introduction will have a presentation of work to date by Nicola about sensitive data vocabularies, and for me about sensitive data categorization system in the framework of Earth Life. And we will have a working meeting with community feedback and review of our work. And after, in the last part of the session, suggestion for form of output that we want to provide. So here you have the collaborative notes in this scan. I encourage you to scan it and to note your name, your affiliations, on your social media partners if you have. And please take notes. You will have a discussion with the questions at the end of the session. And we would like to have all your remarks, so you are part of the actor of this session. So perhaps first, welcome. Thank you to be here. The housekeeping, so very quickly, please be aware that this session is being recorded. We welcome and encourage active participation, so you have the link to the notes. Common meeting notes are located online, and please add your attendance detail. And you can also in your tweet, as you have the link now, tag ResDatal and the hashtag RDA SDIG for sensitive data interest group. Check out for our previous activities, community meeting and output on the RDA webpage. Sensitive Data Interest Group had his birth of failure in 2020, and it was formally endorsed as an interest group since January 2022. The first 2 years focused on identifying case challenge in the sensitive data place and working on shared understanding of terminology for sensitive data. In 2023, the interest group is focusing on sensitive data classification and protocols across region. That is a big issue on topic for lots of peoples. So during this session, we want to progress on outputs that work towards answering the following questions. What classification tools are available to research when assessing the sensitivity of their data? How is conceptualized across regions? And what kind of tools are available to researchers when working with sensitive data within and across region? We will hear about progress on the work, contribute to a working meeting to review this work, and suggest what format you will be used for sharing this work more broadly. In the next step, we have regular meeting during the year, so you will be invited to follow the next step. So first, I will give the floor to Nicola Burton that will present the background of the Sensitive Data Interest Group and that have a presentation after on our work on vocabularies. Nicola, are you online?
Yes, I am. Are you hearing me?
Yes, so I will for the slides. I think that I will follow your instruction.
Okay. Yes,
Yeah.
I think I don't think I have control, so that would be great. Hi, everyone.
If you have control, that's perfect. So I let you presenting.
Oh, no, I don't. You need to advance them for me.
Okay, that's fine. I will do.
Yeah, so hi, my name's Nicola Burton and I work for the Australian Research Data Commons. Roman, if you could go forward.
So, yeah.
Next.
Sorry, I was not on the bottom.
So I'm joining you from Australia, and in Australia, it's very important for us that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we work and meet. So today I'm joining you from the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. So Australia as a country, as you might know it, has been around for a couple of 100 years, but prior to that, it was under the care and custodianship of Aboriginal people going back thousands and thousands of years. I celebrate their continued connection to this land and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Next slide. Okay, so we started this year by reviewing our roadmap that we'd created at the start of the group. And there were 2 areas of future work that we were interested in. So one was titled Developing an Understanding of Different Levels, Risks and Sensitivity of Data across different regions. And another was Developing an Understanding of how to assess and classify data for authentication and authorization governance. So we wanted to go back to the community and make sure that these were still the directions that we wanted to take. So in our May meeting, we did an activity, like you can see here, where we drew out some of the current concerns and interests. And we found that the common theme one of the common themes that the group was really interested in from those original roadmap ideas was looking at the way that sensitive data is classified. So we've selected that as a starting point. Next. So we then went into some further discussion in our July meeting, and these are some of the highlights of that discussion. The first one is that it would be fantastic if everyone classified the sensitivity of data in the same way. If we all just had one scale that ran from whatever, open to highly sensitive, and we could all just communicate and use that scale, it would be fantastic. But it just is never going to work that way. That was the community consensus. The way that data is classified really depends on the regulatory landscape of the place where you're working. It depends on the way that the organization functions, its structure, its risk appetite, all kinds of things like that. So it's not realistic to hope that we're all going to be on the same classification scale, at least anytime soon. So assuming that we are all working with different classification schemes, we're like, well, what could make this easier? And we said, well, one of the things that affects how easy it is to work with a classification scheme, and particularly to move between them, is the way that that scheme is set up. And some classification schemes are just bad. And we had a bit of a discussion about some of the features, which will actually come up a bit in the presentation I'll give you in a second. We also talked a bit about the disconnection between the needs of institutions and IT when they want to classify data, so what their purposes are, versus when researchers want to talk about how sensitive their data is. And we also looked at the fact that just having a classification scheme is fine, knowing what bucket your data falls into, but it's really about how that classification scheme is implemented that's a big part of how these classification schemes impact our use of data and our ability to work across contexts. Next. So then in our September meeting, we came back to these ideas, and we worked out that there were 3 areas of particular interest for the group. One was how to create a useful or effective classification scheme, given that some are better than others. We also considered that it might be interesting and useful to look at differences between the different ways that data is classified in different contexts, so possibly comparing some classification schemes. And then we also thought it would be really useful to look at how to help people assess the sensitivity of their data, because actually applying the scheme can be tricky. And this is with an awareness that, as I said, we're not all using the same classification scheme, but there are particular approaches that might be successful to helping people use whatever scheme they have. So for instance, how do you create an effective decision tool that a researcher can use to quickly and effectively work out where their data fits? Next. So something that did come up in that group is that we were aware that at the moment, as an interest group, we don't currently have the capacity to advance active work in these areas, to provide that guidance or, create the tool or whatever it is. But we all agreed that it would be that they were really useful outcomes. At the moment, we're using them as a focus for information sharing and discussion, but I'd like to take this moment to say that we would really love to bring some more co-chairs into the group and hopefully be able to get to a place where we can do some more active work to advance these important areas. Next, Ramon. Okay, so in that spirit of sharing, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is me, to give you a bit of an institutional perspective from Australia about how data is and can be classified. Next. Okay, so I want to talk to you about the institutional underpinnings program that we ran in ARDC, where I work. I managed this program, and this was a program where universities were coming together to improve their approaches to research data management as institutions. And one of the major outputs that we created was this fairly hefty research data management framework for institutions document, which you can access online. Next. So the program included, well, at the time when we created the framework, which is what I'll talk to you about today, and the sensitive data guidance in there, we had 25 universities working with ARDC to create this guidance. We've now moved on to an extension of this program, which has 32 of Australia's universities, and that's out of a total of 42. So it represents a pretty substantial chunk of the sector. Next. So what happened, there was a long process to develop the framework, but when we got to the stage where the universities had talked about all of their needs and ideas, and they'd worked out what the main areas of research data management were that they wanted to provide guidance on, one of which was sensitive data, we then formed them into working groups. I think we had about 100 experts across all of these working groups who were creating guidance that was going to become the framework. And what we wanted them to do was to recognise that, okay, not all Australian universities operate the same way. So we can't provide prescriptive sort of standards on how an Australian university should manage sensitive data, for instance. But instead, they looked at the principles behind those common successful approaches that they had. They provided case studies and examples of good practice, and they looked for gaps. And so Section 7 of the framework provides a fairly substantial chapter on guidance around how institutions manage sensitive data based on this approach. Next. So I just wanted to highlight, so this is definitely an institutional approach, so a university organisational central data services kind of approach to how sensitive data is managed. And so from the introduction of the section, the working group noted that institutions are motivated to address the sensitivity of data to ensure compliance with ethical and regulatory requirements and to manage risk. So that's their focus. Next. And I'm not going to read you out this whole quote, but this is about how classification schemes are used from the perspective of an institution. So you can see that they're referring to, well, they can be used in policy and procedure. They can be used by ethics committees. They may be used by IT staff when they're working out what systems they should be using, or when they're doing things like migrating data. So it's really about those kind of functional processes within the university. Next, Ramon. So I just wanted to summarise some of the guidance that was provided, because I think it speaks to some of the questions that we had when we were discussing as an interest group earlier in the year. So one thing was some advice more generally about how an institution should think about choosing a classification scheme. And a big piece of guidance was it's really important that there's high-level institutional recognition and support when people go to do this. It's going to involve a lot of change to policy, a lot of change to processes, and it's going to require substantial effort from many different parts of the organisation. So for success, it's really important that there is high-level support from the start. They also highlighted that it's really important to make sure that that your sensitivity classification scheme is only classifying sensitivity. It can be quite tempting to try and slip other things into the scheme, like data quality or reuse value. But as you can imagine, as you start to fold more dimensions into your classification levels, they become less and less usable. So that was quite an important observation. And there was also a recommendation that the classification scheme is based on increasing levels of risk or consequences associated with the data. There can be a temptation to try and define the levels in terms of what the particular kinds of data should be. So for instance, highly sensitive data is data containing sensitive personal information and data that, and so on, and try and list it all out. And the problem with that approach is, first of all, there are so many different ways that data can be sensitive that you'll just never be able to list them all and where they should fall. But also that the sensitivity of data can really depend on context and can change over time. And so it's much better, the group decided, to have a a risk or a consequence-based approach, and for then the person doing the classification to look at the current context and to work out where that data falls, which I think is a pretty common consensus around the world as to how these things are well done. Next. So then we looked a little bit more about what makes a good classification scheme. So one was to use an ordinal structure. That makes sense, so that it just has neatly increasing levels of sensitivity. To keep it simple with relatively few levels. So most of the universities who were in that group had between 3 and 5 levels on their classification scheme. And we did have some discussion about the fact that there's really a trade-off between granularity, so being able to really distinguish between levels of sensitivity, versus simplicity, which actually makes the thing usable. And most there thought that more than 4 levels, you just get to a point where it stops being so usable. And that does create issues in terms of being able to distinguish between what's needed. So that's something that I think needs a bit of further discussion and work. We did talk about needing to cover the extreme ends of the scale. Many universities are not set up to handle very, very, very sensitive data. So for instance, things that are to do with defense, national security, but it's still important that that data can be classified, just with a recognition that the university is not able to actually store or handle data at that classification level. They recommended that we avoid language that's too close to other classifications that exist in the sector. That can be a problem if you're a researcher who also, say, works with government data, and government has its own classification scheme. And if the language lines up in weird ways, things become really confusing. So actually some of the group members had moved towards using just a color coding system to just avoid language completely. And talking about language, they also recommended that we carefully consider and test audience comprehension when defining the levels of a classification scheme. And actually a really interesting point that was made was that, well, if this classification scheme is for classifying the sensitivity of more than one kind of data, so for instance, it's going to cover both research data and enterprise data, something that's really important, and by enterprise data, obviously, I mean sort of like organizational, administrative data. Something that's really important is it can be quite tempting when you set up your scheme to, at the highest level of description, to have examples of what kinds of things fall in, but that can actually be quite off-putting if, for instance, your examples are all about enterprise data, and then a researcher comes along and they look at it and they go, well, that's not about me, or I don't see how that fits. So if there's a risk that that might be the case, the group recommended not having those examples at the high level, but rather having guidance documents that apply to each particular sort of sphere that the classification might be used in, and to provide the examples there. Okay, next slide. So talking about that relationship between research and enterprise data classification, this was quite an interesting discussion, because obviously there are substantial differences between research and enterprise data. And I think often we would say, well, yeah, whatever data classification is being used to classify sort of organizational administrative data, it's not going to work for research data sort of out of the box. They're very different kinds of data. Research data is much more diverse. They've got different risk profiles, different user requirements. It's a problem. So you could have an entirely different bespoke research data sensitivity classification that's built from the ground up, and it is tailored to those needs, which is great. But actually the group ended up saying, well, there are actually substantial benefits to aligning those two classifications, either adapting the existing enterprise data classification to make sure that it fits research data, or making two very closely paralleled classifications. And part of that was about getting senior level buy-in, making sure that it's seen as a priority across the organization, having better access to resources across an organization, and also making sure that there's better understanding between business units. So for instance, an IT department may better understand what needs to be done if the research data classification looks very similar to the enterprise data classification that they're used to. So I thought those were some really interesting observations. Next, Ramon. Okay, so that's just a very quick highlight of, I think there's a good 10 pages of guidance that's provided there. So we'll provide you, brilliant. Alex has provided the link in the chat to the document, and I think there's some great stuff to read there. But from the online version, there's also a link to this table, which you cannot read on this slide, and which is kind of the point. One of the things that the group did was that they took all of the currently available at the time university sensitivity classifications, and they lined them all up in Australia. They lined them all up and they tried to produce a crosswalk across all of them. So you can see they all have about 3 or 4 levels, and you can see how they all line up. And what we found was that there is fairly good alignment across them, but there are also differences. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting piece of work. Next, Ramon. Okay, but and also supporting this work was a project run by the University of Tasmania, Monash University, and the University of Melbourne, where they actually took the guidance that was provided in this section and they applied it to the University of Tasmania was creating a new classification scheme, and Monash University were reviewing their classification scheme. And so they took that advice and they tested it. They found that it did hold up pretty well, that it helped them. And so you've got there's a report which I can also provide a link to. I don't think I gave that one to Alex, which shows the processes that they went through, shows the different regulatory landscapes that they were operating in and how that influenced some differences in what they did. And they did an analysis of how their classification scheme is lined up and where the differences were, which I think is very interesting. And I think one last slide, Ramon. So some future work now. So a lot of the work that the group was doing that's in the framework is about setting up a classification scheme that kind of works and looking at how they can be aligned between universities. But we were very aware that part of the issue is not just that we're all using different sort of sets of levels, but that we don't really understand between institutions what needs to be done with data that falls into a particular classification. So what I do with my highly sensitive data may not be what you do with your highly sensitive data. And that can mean that even though we put the same data into the same bucket, we will still have trouble, for instance, collaborating with that data, moving it between our institutions. So a group of 5 universities are now looking at the particular controls that an institution can put in place around sensitive data. So things around physical security, around cyber security, around governance, and so on and so on. I think they've got a set of maybe 10 different categories. And for each category, they're laying out a spectrum of controls that run from very low control to very high control. And that way, an institution or a project group or anyone can look at this sort of matrix and they can lay out, okay, where do our current controls sit? And you can build a profile either for your organization, for particular kinds, particular levels of sensitivity in your organization. So it's not intended to be prescriptive, but rather as a planning and a communication tool. And I think that that's going to be really useful, particularly for communicating within an organization where some of these controls are applied by IT and some of these controls might be applied by the library or the research office, helping them to understand how they fit together into a picture of how the university manages sensitivity. Okay, I think that is me. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. So we will have the second part of the presentation now. We'll take about the sensitive data categorization system. I will do this presentation, but this is a presentation that was built by Christian Homan from ECRIN, that is a research infrastructure on clinical research. This work was done in the framework of EOS Live, that is one of the 5 clusters in Europe working on federating research infrastructure in research. The 4 others are Shock for Humanities, Escape, PANOSC, and ANVRI. And with 13 infrastructure, and especially 6 in this work, we have tried to see what are the different topics that are covered by sensitive data in the framework of life science. For that, this work of categorization was done in Word Package 4, that is a toolbox for sensitive data. We had a background on needs, special needs, from that were especially expressed by all the network on the areas and all the researchers that were involved in project. 27 projects were accepted in the framework of EOS Life, and it was the main materials that were brought by this network. So there is a need to pull data and digital resource from the life science to fight against global challenge. And there are lots like climate change, epidemics, loss of biodiversity, resource scarcity, and economic dislocations, for instance, but there are others. And there is a high proportion of data considered as sensitive in life science, but the subject of sensitive data is poorly treated. For instance, cross-discipline nature of this data and national legislation in a framework of international context of more than 150 countries make that very, very difficult. Across domain categorization and discovery of digital resource related to sensitive data present major challenge, because we have no agreed vocabularies today, and the work that have done the group shows that there are a lot of discrepancy and lots of differences between meaning of terms between communities. And FAIR principles require common vocabularies and community-approved metadata, not only to access to data, but to give the right to access to the data and to achieve global interoperability in an interdisciplinary context. So sensitive data is at the angle of some research, not only for personal data, but for others. I will show that after. And tools are needed to support discoverability of digital objects related to sensitive data. So that needs to know what are sensitive data without knowing what they are. That is especially difficult because it is sensitive. You don't have to know what they are, but if you are not able to discover them, you will never use them. So we had to build in this toolbox recommendations, procedures, best practice based upon an agreed and community-approved classification. So we had several kinds of challenge. Most of them were finding resources for sharing and reusing sensitive data, how to do that with different kinds of tools and different existing ontologies, vocabularies, and terminologies that are not linked and that are not used in the same way by the same communities, but also can be used by researchers even if they don't come from research. For that, we had an iterative consulting method that was in the interdisciplinary consensus building. That was done through experts, through all of the research infrastructure involved, with data experts, but not only, also with disciplinary experts in life science, And with several discussions, we had classification process. And after testing the classification and trying to rediscuss the classification and retesting, and we had during 2 years 3 iterations of this classification. The result is a first kind of categorization system that is done in 7 big categories that are recovering themselves several times, but it's just to cover several dimensions of this sensitive data. These categorization systems are necessary not only to find data, but also perhaps to give some access to kind of information, because due to the category, the level of sensitiveness will not be the same. So there is a publication in a scientific report that explains the démarche, and I encourage you to go to this publication. So I will not enter in the detail, but as you can see, in each category, we had a subcategory and subcategory. We tried to not divide that in too much level, and it was a hard discussion sometimes to make a groupment of them to be logical, but something practical to have an overview of all the resources that we had in mind. The thing is that in this version 3, we are completely conscious that we are not representing the world, even if it's only in life science. There are lots of things that will be out of a category, and there will be lots of resources that will be sometime in several categories, and it will not be clear where to put them. And to test that, we developed an interface with a way to filter criteria, to have a way to choose several categories in the same time to find some resource. We had free text search and pattern search to identify the resource and to list them and to see if it's current or not. So the work was done on more than 120 resources that were essentially documentary. But we had, after classifying these resources in the categorization several times, between the group of experts, the 12 experts, we had other testers that were evaluating the qualities of the classification. That could be interpreted as a kind of crosswalk between categories. And we see that it's, even if it's 3 iterations, it's not sufficient to have a good agreement of the capacity. We had some interest, strong interest, or agree on the interest of the démarche. The handling of the toolbox was agreed also, and the output of the toolbox is presented as useful and clear format, and the usability and the fast response time is okay. So that's technical, but after some aspects, like the search capabilities to find source about sensitive data are not just adequate, even if it's done after 2 years and by only experts. So for this categorization, that is the base for future work, one of the possible base for categorization at the international level. We have identified several work. First, to require broad community approval. So at this step, we have something like 20% involved. It could be broader. The categorization system needs to be included in metadata standard catalogs, even if it's not metadata schema, it's metadata content. That means that, you know, in FAIR principles, you have sufficient metadata. That means that must be appropriate metadata. And on these content of metadata, there are few works that are done in sensitive data that is, I think, and we think, something really crucial. The content of the toolbox needs to be extended in number and coverage of resources. So it was just due to the capacity of work that we had in this work package, and the toolable need to be improved according to the suggestion of the testers, for instance, the search functions and things like that. So another option could be explored based on this work and perhaps other is to use AI, artificial intelligence or machine learning algorithm to support automatic tagging of resource and see if it's fit with the advice and the classification of experts. And another promising approach could be to consider knowledge graph as an intelligent representation through, for instance, OpenAI or other, but trying to map all the resources and after having a work on the level of sensitiveness, for instance. So the challenge that we have is the transition of this categorization system and the toolbox that is around to a mature toolbox and ultimately its maintenance, extension, and sustainability, as it is based on project now that is not something sustainable at the broader scale. So perhaps in the framework of RDA and this interest group, this work could have a following step or several following steps. The development of the toolbox demonstrator was financed by Earthclive, but we have to find others. And discussion of sustainability have been initiated with several life science infrastructure. So they have means, but not to do that alone. And we would like to ensure that this work could be reused, not at the European level, but the international level. So different approaches are under evaluation. An organization considering the resource core to its operations and taking full responsibilities or joint ownership across multiple organizations. Or community taking responsibility either funded by future grants. That could be this interest group or a future working group. So here in this page, you have all the resources where you can find what was done, what is reusable and in CC BY. All the slides will be online, so and you will find the link to the slides in the notes. So please go to the slides, go to the notes to take these informations and to put your remarks and your suggestion of increasing. So now it's a discussion. Thank you for your attention for this presentation. Alex, can I give you the floor, perhaps to introduce one or two elements for the discussion now?
Sure.
Yeah, sorry.
Bit of a surprise for me. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. So as Nicola and Roman have just presented, we've been doing a lot of work over the last, few years, but Nicola and Roman have sort of told you a little bit about their work and how it touches onto our sensitive data interest group work. Actually, Nicola, I'm so sorry to do this, but you had a kickoff question for us.
Happy to go. I guess when I was looking at these two presentations as we were putting the slides together, and I was very aware that so the work that I presented is very much from an institutional, university, organizational point of view, and designed obviously, with the purpose of serving research needs, but really it's driven by the needs of the organization. And whereas the work that Roman was presented seems much more driven by disciplinary needs, and the approach seems to be different. And I suppose I wondered whether anyone had any thoughts about how those organizational versus researcher needs kind of butt up against each other when we try and classify the sensitivity of data.
Maybe I can jump in with just one kind of broad comment. Thank you, Nicola, for putting that sort of proposition question to us. So for example, in my current role, I work as a researcher, but also as somebody who, I guess, is working to socialize and share with colleagues across the university the type of infrastructure that exists or is being developed. And so, like, for me, a challenge is actually those two roles and how they interact with one another. And I think sometimes speaking for the institution and its requirements. So, for example, Melbourne University was part of the that great body of work, Nicola, that you presented, but socializing that to researchers across the institution, and not just researchers, because we are all one academic community, my university, there are challenges around that. So just one point for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. I will ask to the room. There are 35 people in the room, on 15 online. Do you have questions, remarks? Yes, I see over there somebody. Please present yourself also if people. I know
hello.
that.
Oh, is it working? Yeah, it's working. Oh, now it's working. Thank you very much for this discussion. And I'm not sure whether you included this in your classification or not, but I've been, I work with people from all kinds of fields because I coordinate my university's research data repository. And I come across all kinds of comments about sensitiveness being context dependent. And this applies very often to indigenous populations, sometimes in Brazil when they live 10 kilometers away from each other. So in one indigenous population, some data are sensitive and 10 kilometers away, it doesn't matter, but something else is. How would you put this or account for this or include this kind of thing in this classification, or is this not part of your scheme? Thank you.
Perhaps I could try to respond about the classification system that we have done, but after Nicola, about the vocabularies, perhaps you have other ideas. For the classification system, a part of the classification are disciplinary related, but others are about context. Just because you can't provide the same sensitiveness in one disciplinary for things that are related to two different kind of sensitiveness. For instance, in dual use research concern, for instance, I work in ERINA, that is European Research Infrastructure on highly pathogenic agents. We have BSL-4 laboratories, so the aspect of personal data is secondary in this case. But in other research, it's the primal proxy for sensitiveness of lots of data. It depends. For clinical data, for instance, the personal data are pregnant. But to provide something that is coherent, but we must try to see all the aspects, all the dimensions at the same time, to give after something very simple to read and to apply as a right. Because if you have the right for that, but not for that, but half for that, it will be difficult to apply. But after that is the topic of the discussion today. So if you have advice, do you have any reaction about that in the room? If not, Nicola, do you have something to add?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, that exact issue is really why the advice at the institutional level was not to try and specify the content sort of qualities of the data, such as, it contains personal information when defining the classification scheme, that it should be about consequence or risk. just because otherwise, especially because for a university which is supporting so many different disciplines, if you have an organization-wide classification scheme, it just becomes completely untenable to try and draw out all of those aspects. So instead, it's about putting it in these broad kind of levels, which are about level of sensitivity, and then providing specific guidance at, I mean, potentially you might have to go to the domain level and say, okay, for the kinds of data that you are working with, here is how you need to apply the scheme right now. And you might need to work with disciplinary experts to help them, to help their researchers to work out where their data falls, because you need that expertise. So yeah, it's a kind of, I think, a multi-layered process where you have the broad classification that sits on the top that helps you to work with policy, to work with IT, and then you need to look at things like context and content in a kind of potentially in a kind of discipline by discipline way, or yeah.
Thank you, Nicola. Any reaction in the room or online? I don't see what is happening in the chat. Can you check if there is a questions or?
Nothing in the chat at the moment.
Nothing in the chat, okay. So I guess that if you have questions, you can add them in the chat. Do not hesitate. Online, somebody is.
So I do have a question.
Yes.
My name is Ziad. I'm one of the data stewards at Ghent University, Belgium. So maybe I've missed it, but I see that none of you are actually EU-based. Am I correct?
EU-based?
None of you, well, except you, European-based.
Ah.
So I'm just thinking from a GDPR perspective regarding personal data classification. So to my knowledge, correct me, my European colleagues, our classification of personal data is based on the GDPR, which is not a university mandate, it's an EU-wide mandate. So when it comes to your institutions, how is the interaction between a government law or mandate and the internal processes? What takes precedence? Thank you.
Who want to answer to this question?
Well, I was just going to say, so that is the institutional, I mean, yeah, so legislation and external regulation is going to take precedence, and that's why the university classification schemes are so driven by compliance and risk management, because they're really set up to enable the university to meet its legal requirements. And in fact, GDPR, although we're not in the EU, it touches any organization which is collecting data which is about EU citizens, which means that it is fairly at the forefront of the minds of privacy officers here in Australian universities. So it is starting to be reflected in our classifications as well. So generally what will happen is that someone will have to sit down with all of the regulations and legislation that applies to the university and work out how to produce a classification scheme that enables the university to meet those needs.
Thank you, Nicola. Yes, I would like to add also, just because I was involved in several Belmont Forum projects that is at the worldwide, not EOSCLAV, that is European one. So that fit very well with GDPR. In others, there are the equivalency of GDPR, but not with the same terms. And that's often the big issue, is to compare what is anonymized to the anonymized in for instance, in USA, and in France, pseudo-anonymized doesn't exist in Europe at the legal level. So we have this kind of discrepancy, but at the legal level, it will take lots of time to be arranged. But before that, perhaps we could provide some advice on the good or bad practice, and just identifying the gaps as a first step. Any other reaction on the room or online? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do not.
This is Claudia again. because besides my university, I'm also involved in state policies and national policies, and among other things about data protection. And Brazil has a data protection law, which is based on GDPR, and lots of Latin American countries are beginning to create their laws. And this is a question, in fact, to you and to the audience. The main problem with these laws, the first one is that data that were open are being closed now because since people do not understand the law, they are afraid of violating the law, and therefore lots of open repositories have been closed. The second, the law, it was in Brazil. It passed in 2018 and it started being applied in 2020. So it's quite new, but very recently, actually 2 months ago, the national agency that takes care of application verification of the law in terms of ethics published a public consultation on how to implement some of the law's items in terms of data collection, data privacy, and so on and so forth. And what it shows in terms of vocabulary is that the people who are trying to check the law, they do not understand all the technical issues, and they have very specific views of what should be protected and what should not be protected. Namely, they are not technically aware of things that should or could happen. I don't know if I made myself clear. What I want to know is whether those enforcing or those taking care of sensitive data in your countries, there is the lower level, which are the people who actually work with the data, but there are those who are trying to enforce the law who are at the national or state level. These people are still behind in terms of technical considerations. And therefore, the application of these regulations become more complicated. Did I make myself clear?
Yes,
No.
I guess.
Oh, okay.
Is there an immediate reaction on that in the room? Yes, I see one hand. Please introduce yourself for
Yes.
the next exchange. It will be easier.
Hello, my name is Lars Eklund, and I work as a domain specialist in sensitive data in Sweden. What we've found in Sweden in regards to this is that having cross-competence groups work together. So we work together with the DPOs because we have to relate to the GDPR, of course, among other things. So we work together with the DPOs and try to advise them. And we've seen that for most of these, when a researcher comes, having at the institutional level, having cross-competence groups working so that you have both technical personnel and legal personnel working in the same group, looking at the same problem, is really helpful for figuring this out, especially when it comes to issues where when we're working with pseudonymization or anonymization, and we're talking about something that is quite often missed, which is the risk of re-identification. Because a lot of times aggregation of multiple fields of data, you can actually get back to having very high risk of identification if you have environmental data and you combine it, for example, with health data, then you can usually pinpoint exactly where a person is and who they are and what they've done. So even though there might not be any what the legal department would classify as personal data inside that identifiable data inside that data set, it's still identifiable. And there is where we need, from the technical side, we need to help them understand that, okay, in this particular data set, you need to think about it in this way. So I think for us, what has worked a lot is generating these cross-domain groups where you have competences from IT security, from research specialists, and from the legal department, and working in solving the problems.
Thank you, Lars. Any reaction on the room or in the chat? I don't see the chat, so if there's
Roman, Luke Decker made a comment that in their experience as a data librarian, researchers continue to confuse sensitive data and sensitive personal data, where sensitive personal data is a subset with specific requirements. I don't know, Luke, if you would like to speak to that, but thank you for making that comment in the chat.
Okay, so I had this reflection from the last session of our group. Do you remember, for those who were here, what we said about an asteroid coming to the Earth and scratching in 2 days the humanity? It's not sensitive, just because everybody knows that it will arrive and nobody cares. So that is asking what is the risk of publication of some data or not. So often it's a question of perception, and this perception notion is different through cultures, regions, and laws. And the question is, how can we harmonize these things, respecting the difference of cultures, but also respecting the new challenge that we fit, because sometimes we are sharing completely freely very sensitive data, but as nobody knows that they are sensitive, everybody shares them. So I don't know if you have some examples, but I think that in environmental science, we have lots of them for instance, breakout, or for, I don't know, seismic risk and things like that. So what is sensitive? What are the risks? The definition of the risk? Do you have some experience on it, and how we could share that? I see somebody wants to. Sorry, I don't remember.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's Ziad again from Ghent University. I do have a question regarding this dichotomy between personal sensitive and sensitive. In my mind, the first thing that comes as sensitive but not personal would be something that pertains to valorization, like technical know-hows, patents that are being developed. So I'm the data steward for social and behavioral sciences, and usually there is not much valorization there, but we do have personal data. But again, during this wonderful conference, I heard many things that data without proper context is not really data, it's even garbage. So even if we have something sensitive like seismic activities or crime rate, let's say, in a certain neighborhood that might drive down, rent or so, if it's not presented in a way that is readable, with proper metadata, it's not really sensitive. Mm-hmm. Also, there's due diligence, because again, when we talk about anonymization processes, there's many assumptions at play. For example, a potential attacker would have background information. So it could be like identity disclosure or inferential disclosure. So for example, I work at Ghent University at the main library. If you just run a survey and ask like, who is actually from the EU, I would say, I'm not. Again, male, mid-30s, eventually Ziad is identified without pointing to Ziad specifically. So I agree with you, context is key. But thank you for that seismic thing. I've never thought about it, that would be sensitive, actually. For me, it's always in the valorization, the intellectual property, right? When it's sensitive, but not necessarily personal. So that's my comment. I would love to hear your feedback.
Nicola, Alex, do you have some reaction?
I was going to say the other kind of sensitive data that we deal with a lot. So there's intellectual property. There's also, obviously, yeah, ecology. We see a lot of things around, for instance, the location of protected species, and that can be an issue if you have information about, for instance, the nesting sites of endangered birds. It's very important that data is not just presented openly, because it's very easily and frequently abused, I think. And I suppose also then, yeah, there is not just IP, but there's also there's commercial data. So for instance, there's interesting things I'm learning, like groundwater data can actually tell you things about mining sites that can have problems, that can create problems to do with like monopolies and fair trading between mines. It's yeah, there's a very complicated world out there. So there are a lot of kinds of data that are not about people at all, that can be quite sensitive. And I suppose that's also why it's interesting to think about how regulations like privacy law or GDPR relate to how we think about the sensitivity of data, because obviously, yeah, GDPR is not the only thing that might make data sensitive, although it is an important one.
Thank you, Alex. Do you have something to add, or
yeah, maybe just a quick, maybe just a quick comment. So, like in many places in Australia, we occasionally work with First Nations data. And that can be obviously a privilege to work with, but also in terms of sensitivity, there are so many factors at play that need to be considered. So you, before there was mention of, I guess, recognizing kind of, hang on, I'll start again, about ways in which that culture, people's cultures need to be kept in mind. So I think in some of the work that I do, that's very much front of mind. Sometimes it is not appropriate for researchers or for non-Indigenous people to have access to First Nations data, which can be sensitive just by that, just by its very kind of nature. And also within, as we may know, First Nations data, it can be only sometimes only particular groups can have access to it. So there's different levels of sensitivity even within a particular group of people who may share a culture. So maybe others in the room have some experience here.
Yes, Lars, you want to take the floor?
Yeah. So I think you all touch on a very common and important thing, and that is why the idea of risk assessment that Nicola talked about earlier is the key, because the key to whether something is sensitive is based on risk of harm. And I think that something that we need to be more aware of and to teach researchers and others out there is that to do the impact assessment of your research, no matter what research or whatever administrative part you're working with, no matter whether or not you are doing something that you think is sensitive or not, because not until you've done your impact assessments and check, is this going to harm something or someone, can you actually determine whether or not you're working with sensitive data or not? Because it comes down to risk and risk of harm, I think.
Yes, I see over there. Sorry. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. My name is Victoria Smith. I'm with the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and I'm a sensitive data specialist, now working in data governance and data ethics and leading a Canadian initiative on supporting repositories with developing services and technology that support sensitive data ingest. And I have a question for you on, so I'm quite interested in research ethics arguments related to discovery and accessibility to sensitive data, particularly controlled access. And I wonder how consent features in the classification schemas that you've been looking at, because to my mind, it's almost a separate variable. You might have very sensitive data with a high profile for risk, but if you've obtained good and clear consent to manage it in a particular way, that is to grant access and so on, that's meaningful then, right? And it's an important consideration there. And so I've been supporting an argument in the Canadian context that, you know, when we research ethics is largely about mitigating and balancing potential harms and potential benefits. And I think there's a traditionally sort of paternalistic attitude that says people don't really understand the risks associated with data sharing. So we just, on their behalf, sort of assume that they don't want to do that. But when surveyed, for the most part, research participants believe their data is being shared, even when it isn't, and tend to want for it to be shared. So I'm quite keen on sort of exploring mitigating harms from the perspective of minimizing data collection and the burdens associated with original data collection and the potential benefits associated with data reuse. So my sort of broad question to you is, how do you look at consent in the context of classifying risk? And what do you think that means for engaging institutions with developing sort of approaches, services, policies, tools, guidance for researchers in terms of balancing harm and creating secure mechanisms for stewardship and reuse of sensitive data? Thank you.
Thank you. So I have perhaps a response, but I would like to know if it's related or not. No, so I will just perhaps have an answer, but perhaps before Nicola and Alex, do you have something to say about that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think that I very much agree with everything you've said. And I think that there are definitely just limitations to, well, the kind of classification scheme that I was talking about, that a university might use to work out, are we putting this data in the correct storage? Is it protected in the right way? Do we need to be careful about when we move it, what we expose it, how we expose it? I think that kind of classification scheme is really important, but it can only get you so far. It's necessarily going to be broad, it's going to be these broad bands, right? Maybe if you're talking about four, maybe 5 levels that cover the entire range of how sensitive data can be, you're just not going to be able to get the kind of specificity that can cover those kind of needs. And so I think that you need to think about what the classification scheme is for and what else you need on top. So, for instance, if you're saying your classification scheme maybe can tell you things about where the data can be stored, what kinds of protection IT need to put on it, but whether it is okay if it's public or not. But then if you're talking about, but who can have access and what are the conditions for their access and what are the governance controls for their access, that can't be included in the classification scheme. And those are the kinds of things which I think consent is much more likely to touch on. So you might say, well, this is, in theory, highly sensitive data. We need to protect it. We need to make sure that it's not just exposed on the internet. But it is perfectly fine for it to be made available to others under the correct conditions. And that needs to be something that's dealt with separately. That would be my answer.
Thank you, Nicola. I just will add some ideas. It's not against or for your ideas, just about clear and explicit consent. It will depend on the kind of data that you will share. Some data are not related to person, so if it's not a person, it's not a question of consent, or perhaps a consent of a group. For instance, biodiversity data, you will not ask to the species if it's agreed to be shared, but sometimes it's better to be shared than to be erased because of there will be a building on this place. I have another example just to fit the discussion about the pandemic. You know that ERINA and all the network of highly pathogenic agents were very involved in the COVID-19 crisis. And in this case, you have some public data or private data that will have sense to be shared, and the risk to not be shared is more important than the risk to be shared. And in this case, we have to mitigate and to put something in place that permit to choose to share sensitive data just because the game is not the same. After, it depends of the kind of data. For health data, it is the case, but I think that it's for all risks the same thing. If there is a reaction again, perhaps you or others.
I'm going to very quickly jump
Yes.
in and apologize that I have to leave now. I have an unavoidable appointment, but thank you so much to everyone for the conversation so far, and I will be watching the recording so that I can catch up with the last 20 minutes. Thank you all.
Thank you, Nicola. Thank you. So
my
the
name
floor
is
is yours.
Liva Kvala. I'm from the University of Oslo. So I have a long list, but I think I'll start at the bottom with time and how time is placed into these categories, because we know that time can change the level of sensitivity. And in archives, it's common that after 50 or 70 years, documents can be disclosed because they were sensitive, but they're no longer sensitive. So when we archive data for the future, how can we also add this into our classification? Data that are sensitive at a given time, but are supposed not to be sensitive in the future. I think that is an aspect that we really need to add, because we can't risk deleting everything or losing things that are sensitive now because we don't have the capacity to think for the future. So, any solutions?
Any reaction, perhaps online? Can you check the chat also? Yes, online, there is a reaction.
I've got one. So I'm in Perth, Western Australia, and each state in Australia has its own requirements around retention and disposal. So here in WA, we have the WA University sector disposal, which is used within the universities. So by default, all data collected within universities needs to be retained for at least 7 years. But there are criteria that layer on top of that where data is retained for a lot longer. So the idea is that for sort of a fairly standard research project where there's nothing particularly special about it, the data is retained for 7 years, but it's not saying that at that 7 years it is automatically destroyed. It's saying that it is reevaluated to see if the value of the data has changed in that time. And if it has become significant for all sorts of different reasons, then you retain it longer and it gets extra time. So I see that as maybe an option. Having some kind of mechanism in place where you reevaluate over a period of time could be a way to go. I don't know if other countries do that or whether that's a specific Australian thing. I'd love to find out.
Thanks, Kelly. I've seen another reaction from Luc online. Do you want to react directly?
Yes.
Or not?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Just there was a comment about using consent form and data sharing agreement. So comment about some Kylie, and then I just added that also for data repository we use data. We have data use agreement, which is a more specific form, which is designed for data repository when we want to share sensitive data without making the data fully open. So this is our, we are currently at this step about, we're thinking about that here at IRD where I work with. I know that for some data repository, all data can be only downloaded after data signing data use agreement. So it's a systematic.
Thank you. Any reaction on that on the room or online? Yes, Lars. Can we have the microphone, please?
Maybe can I make one comment?
Yes,
And instead of the
yeah,
sorry.
please go ahead.
Oh no, sorry. I was just going to say, sort of actually the reverse of what we've been talking about. I have some colleagues who are exploring the idea of data deletion day, which sort of seems to go against a lot of, I guess, our principles. But on the other hand, as you've been saying, Kylie, like perhaps we don't need to keep everything forever, but it needs to be recessed, and maybe we do. But then there's the time factor, Lifa, that you mentioned. So I do find the prospect of data deletion day quite thrilling, but also terrifying. So anyway, I've had a comment that maybe we should be wrapping up soon. So I don't know, Roman, if people in the room would like to make any final comments, or maybe you would like to, or I can.
I could just
Lars wanted to yes, please go ahead.
So I just wanted to inject a little answer to the colleague here from in the back who talked about archiving and the time aspect, and this is a really difficult aspect because of course the GDPR requires data minimization, for example, when it comes to personal data, which means you should remove as much data as you possibly can. The other part, of course, comes from the technical side, which is basically storage. Storing something for a very long time is very complicated, especially when you're talking about secure systems. So we're in that. But then we also, like, for example, me in Sweden, we have different laws that come in conflict to each other. So we have the archive law that comes in and says all data has to be stored for at least 15 years, at least. And then also another part that is for 50 years. But that also comes in conflict with the law of data minimization from GDPR, because you need to remove the data that you don't actively need. And this is somewhat of a difficult situation at the moment, that usually only can be solved by asking lawyers at the time to decide which part of this needs to be concerned first. But it is a very difficult situation we are in. But in general, I would say that it is good if we can take the time concept in, that things may desensitize over time, but we also have to think about the retention value and whether or not it actually fulfills, if we actually need to keep it due to minimization. So try and minimize the amount of data we're saving about people.
Any other reaction? Yes, I see one hand over there. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, Gabriela Pino from Universidad Nacional in Costa Rica. Hi, and thank you very much for all the work that you have been doing. Well, it's just a little thing. I think that one of the things that you have to have in mind always is that risk assessment is not that easy and will change with new technologies, with new circumstances in your region, in your country, in the world. And then that is something that all the researchers, the research managements, the legal departments in university or institutions or even in companies have to have in mind always that circumstances can change, and then something that was not sensitive now is sensitive, then we have to change, and we have to go back to that data and change whatever we have to change, and not be aware of that changes is a risk in itself. Then it's something that that the people have to be sensitive about. That harm is very blurry term, very blurry concept in our world.
Yeah, I would like to react also on that, because in health challenge and issues, we have this kind of problematic. Okay, you hide something, but what are the consequences to hide them? And sometimes it's a catastrophe. It's more disease, more injuries than before. So we have to measure exactly, but it's not like in the environment. We don't know if the good precaution is to show or not to show. And for the risk assessment, I think that it is a challenge to define that properly in each context. But that's a part of the work that we have to do. Is there another reaction on the room or in the chat? Yes.
So again, Ziad, I want to say something. When it comes to, at least from a Belgian perspective, each university, I would say, interpret the GDPR in its own manner. So we have to fill a GDPR record if you're processing personal data. In our GDPR, we have a question that if you answer more than 2 answers in it, you are forced or obliged to fill a DPIA, so data protection impact assessment. Of course, you can't just have like you fill 2 answers and voila, you fill it. However, it does give you a basis that your data might have that harmful impact that Lars was talking about. And I would like actually to share or discuss the GDPR record we have at our university to whomever is interested. Maybe it gives you insights into your own harmful assessment impact. Thank you.
Thank you, Zed. Any other remark or reaction in the room? Alex.
Yes, sorry, just a quick comment just as we wrap up. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I've just put a few comments in the chat. Please join our interest group. We're very keen to open up our community to be more inclusive, even than it is. But yes, thank you everyone for your comments. And next year, what we are looking to do is perhaps having less sort of co-chair meetings, but actually to be running this in a more sort of, I guess, community-oriented fashion. So we've been doing monthly community meetings. Some of the comments made today would be such brilliant topics for us to discuss or sort of drill down further into and to learn from all the many experiences of participants today here in the room, the real room and the virtual room. So yes, I've popped in email address or join us via the RDA website. And yeah, we've had really terrific discussions, like quite sort of provocative, important conversations in our community meetings, and we would love to have for you to join us. So yes, thank you. And thank you, Roman, for running the session in Salzburg. Wish I was there.
Okay, thank you. So is there any other reaction on that? If not, I would like to just say for closing the session that you have the notes. We have taken some notes also in our corner. I have to fill them because I was not on internet, but it's an ongoing work where you are all invited, or you can invite people. And the ambition is to try to make a kind of try of classification and level definition at the border scale across regions. So the objective and the challenge are high. We know that, but if we don't try, we will never do. So please come with us. Try to build this system with us. We will present it, and the way that we will try to build it is through a first publication with some kind of advice of what could work or what could not work together, and publish it with all authors that want to participate. So if you want, just put your name and your affiliations and your email in the notes, and please, you can come to the next meeting. If you can't come to some meetings because they are not at the good time slot, it's not a problem. You just have to say, okay, I want to participate. We will do that with radical collaboration methods that were applied through RDA, for instance, with the COVID-19 recommendation document. That was a really good document, helpful for lots of laboratories, lots of data centers about pandemic, but we have time this time. For more time. So please participate, and thank you to be here. Thank you, Alex, for all your work. You were behind all of this, and it's really nice. And thanks to Nicolas also, and to Christian that prepared my presentation. It was not me. And have a good rest of RDA and a good day today. And thank you again.
Hey everyone, nice to meet you finally. How are you?
Fine, that was all.